I'm going to start. I think there are going to be some stragglers continuing to come in from the outside, but I want to say good afternoon and welcome everybody here to the Atlantic Council. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dick Morningstar. I'm the founding director and chairman of our Global Energy Center. It's great to see such an excellent turnout today to cap off what's been a historic week, I think, in the world of LNG and global gas markets, historic events on the Hill. David Karani might comment a little more on that in a couple of minutes, but also on Monday, I was lucky enough to attend the inauguration of Cheniere's Sabine Pass LNG export facility on the Louisiana Gulf Coast. And I think this occasion constitutes not just a major landmark for Cheniere, but also for the broader U.S. energy industry and global energy markets, and hopefully very much so in Europe, which we'll be talking about today. So in the wake of the ceremony in Louisiana, we're very pleased to host an excellent lineup of speakers today to consider the future of U.S. LNG exports and to assess the impact that American energy resources will have on the energy security of our European allies. This is not a new subject, but it is something I think especially apropos to be talking about this week. We're especially happy to see such excellent representation from government practitioners and from private sector leaders who've worked on this issue so extensively in the European context. So I'm looking forward to an excellent discussion on current state and the future trajectory of transatlantic energy engagement and European energy security. Before turning it over to David Karani, who most of you know, I want to mention two things. I think we have available outside the LNG paper that Bud Coote, who is our resident senior fellow, and many of you know from his many years as an energy analyst at the so-called agency across the river. And Bud's in the audience back in the middle. He's very unpretentious. He always sort of sits somewhere where nobody will see him. And next to John Roberts there, similarly unpretentious. But I also want to mention our Wrocław Forum that will be taking place on June 2nd through 4th. And I'm glad that Fran Burwell, who's the director of the Wrocław Forum, came in and is listening to me mention it, because if I hadn't, she would have found me and she would have killed me. So I am talking about it on June 2nd through June 4th, in which we'll be talking about many of these issues, and hopefully many of you will also be able to attend. So with that, I will turn things over to David Karani, the director of our Eurasian Energy Futures Initiative, who has spearheaded the Council's work and the Global Energy Center's work on these issues. So, David, it's all yours.
Thank you, Dick. Good afternoon to everyone. Let me join Ambassador Morningstar in welcoming you here at the Atlantic Council today on a depressingly rainy spring day. As Dick mentioned, I'm David Karani, the head of the Eurasian Energy Futures Initiative. Together with Ambassador Morningstar, we are spearheading the Atlantic Council's work on European and Eurasian energy markets and energy security issues, also gearing up, in addition to Wrocław, the Istanbul Energy and Economic Summit, which we hold every November in Istanbul. As Ambassador Morningstar mentioned, we gather here at a very opportune moment to discuss the ramification of U.S. LNG exports on European energy security in what I would call a fast-changing global policy and market environment. Just last week, we witnessed the signing of the landmark Paris Climate Agreement in New York by many of the leaders who were there in Paris as well. Also last week, we, lo and behold, witnessed something extraordinary here in Washington, which was the adoption of a bipartisan legislation on energy modernization in the Senate, and we are hoping that a similar bill will be passed on the House side, which is very important also in the context of today's discussion, because it contains provisions on further expediting the LNG licensing procedure and setting deadlines in that procedure. Next week, we are going to have the EU-US Energy Council here in town, which is another major event, and gas will be on the agenda of that council meeting. And then, as Ambassador Morningstar mentioned, probably the most important event this week on Monday, we gathered down in Houston, then in Louisiana, to celebrate the really momentous achievement represented by what I would call a pioneering project by Cheniere's Sabine Pass, which is the first LNG export terminal in the lower 48. And it's indeed hard to underestimate the impact on European energy security, the fact that the United States is becoming a major, one of the biggest LNG exporters in the next 5 years. And many of you in the room actually worked very hard to make that a reality. So I think it's a celebratory moment in many ways for all of us. So we have a very rich program today. We have 3 panels. It's going to be a long afternoon, but bear with us. The first panel will be on the challenges of European energy security and the European Energy Union. And that's a panel to set the scene and discuss the progress that the EU has made in the last decade or so on the energy security front, but also talk about the remaining challenges for European energy security, with special regard to Central and Eastern Europe, diminishing but continued vulnerability. The second panel will be focusing more on the commercial realities, the global gas market developments, and it will discuss the global gas picture on the supply and also on the demand side, and the implications of a coming LNG glut on European energy security. And then the last panel on energy infrastructure integration and supply diversification challenge in Europe, we'll finally look at the EU's LNG strategy under discussion, discussing the remaining infrastructural gaps, bottlenecks in Europe, but also discussing some of the regulatory challenges that the European market faces. And then finally highlight some of the dilemmas that the EU and some of the member states face in terms of gas supply diversification. So as again Ambassador mentioned, we have a terrific lineup. All 3 panels consist of what I would say the creme de la creme of transatlantic energy security experts, policymakers, and business leaders. And I have the pleasure of introducing the first panel, that is going to be moderated by Keith Johnson, who is a senior reporter with Foreign Policy, and will feature Robin Donegan, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the State Department responsible for energy diplomacy, and then the government envoys from the Visegrad countries, from Poland, from the Czech Republic, from Slovakia, and from Hungary. I expect a very lively conversation in all 3 panels. I will come back to introduce the second and the third panel, but now I would like to hand it over to Keith, who is going to moderate the discussion. The one final thing I have to say is that this is an on-the-record conversation. This is live webcast as we speak, and it's going to be on the website eventually as well. And those of you who tweet, please use the hashtag #ACEnergy. So without further ado, Keith, thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much, David. Thank you, Ambassador Morningstar, and welcome to all of you to this panel. I think we've got 3 great opportunities to talk about a few of the big issues that affect both economics and security in Europe. What I wanted to do with our panelists today, we've got perspectives from both Central and Eastern Europe as well as from the U.S. State Department, was to take a few minutes first and let our speakers sort of lay out the view of energy security in terms of the challenges and the opportunities that they see from their respective perches. And I would also like to see if Robin could weigh in and talk about, from the State Department, the Bureau of Energy and Natural Resources, sort of how U.S. energy diplomacy has evolved in recent years, especially towards Central and Eastern Europe. Ambassador Bartuszek, would you like to start with the perspectives of the Czech Republic? What do you see in terms of energy security?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. I might surprise you, but basically what I saw in my country in the last 10 years is diminishing importance of the topic of energy security, because I think we have basically done the homework over the last 25 years with the pipelines for oil and gas built in the 1990s and the contract with Norway since 1997 and being part now of the Northwestern European gas market fully in the last 5 years. So actually when Russia, well, not Russia, sorry, Little Green Man took Crimea in February 2014, and then Russia started something in Ukraine. We had a Security Council meeting immediately that Sunday, and the Prime Minister asked me, what are the implications for us? What can happen to us? And I said, well, frankly, not much. In both in oil and gas, we are fairly well supplied by the pipelines, and that's what exactly happened. Nothing really happened in the last 2 years, either to us or to anyone else in Central Europe. We've basically seen that the famous or fabled energy weapon of Russia simply did not fire in the last 2 years. So I would say on this front, we basically moved energy security much from the foreign policy field to the basic market area. It's now a discussion about what should be the price of gas. For us, the price of gas is formed in Netherlands and Germany at Rotterdam and LNG markets. Oil price is global. So for us, for example, the LNG opening in the US is definitely something we very much welcome. We've helped, I think, a little bit in the last 3 years to get it through on the Hill and DOE and elsewhere. The same with the oil exports. So we welcome another, as we like to say, another boring exporter of oil and gas on the global market. You know, in our part of the world, for Americans, in America, boring is a bad word. In Central Europe, boring is good. Okay, so we love to be bored. You know, we've been part of headlines for much of the 20th century, and it's not really good. So being boring is fine. We welcome another boring supplier to the global market, the one which actually plays by the rules, doesn't use energy as a weapon, and basically just sells what he has for this decent price. I mean, that's nice. Welcome. And what we now definitely watch the most in my country is how far we can spread the present, let's say, Western European or Northwestern European gas market throughout the continent. At the present, you basically have one contiguous area of roughly 200 million people, northern France, Benelux countries, Germany, Britain, Denmark, Norway, Czech Republic, Austria, which is fairly well supplied by natural gas from different places. We have fairly strong position vis-a-vis suppliers. We would love to see that area spread throughout the EU 28, because in the end, 500 million people can get much better prices from outside world than just 200 million. And I believe that the years ahead will be much more difficult for us than the years so far. Because globally, Europe is the only region in the world, together with East Asia, which doesn't have enough raw materials and enough energy supplies on its own territory. Every other continent, every other region has enough. Americas, Middle East, Africa, Asia. The East Asia and Europe are the only two regions which seem to be dependent on imports of oil and gas for decades to come. And we should expect much more difficult conditions in decades to come. So the work is on us to make unified market inside the EU to be better prepared for years to come.
I wanted to just follow up with Europe, and then I'll come back to the U.S. perspective. But Mr. Szakváry, from the Hungarian point of view, you're landlocked there in the center of Europe. You've got to have a lot of the same energy concerns, or not, as Czech Republic. Is it Czechia or Czech Republic these days?
I love Czech Republic. If I may, let's stick to it.
Okay, so in the Czech Republic. And so I wanted to follow up on this notion, because when we talk about Europe and energy security, there's a tendency to sort of be trapped in a time warp to a certain extent. And mentally, we always think back to 2006. We think back to 2009, when there were actual physical supply disruptions from Russia. As the ambassador mentioned, post-Crimea, there were no actual supply disruptions. There were reverse flows between different countries that mitigated a lot of the risks. I mean, is it even legitimate to speak about the worries of European energy security in today's landscape?
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. I would say partly yes, because Czech Republic's market is pretty much integrated to the Western European markets, while the Hungarian and the Slovak and the Poland is having a market which still has a much lower liquidity and dependent on a single supplier. So then in the last 10 years, from 2006, a lot has been done. So many investments have happened. For example, in Hungary, we have 7 neighboring countries, and we are physically linked to 6 out of them. And we are working also on the last one. And the current policy is to complete all that with the reverse flows. So then that dramatic feeling which hit the whole EU, but also Central Europe, made so big changes that these investments have happened, while still we have the same physical flow. And believe me that the natural gas traders in Eastern Europe are very creative to repackage the same volume. But if there is no flow and the pipes would dry up, then that creativity is not enough. So then we would say that we are at the half success. And really 2 out of the 6 interconnectors that I mentioned provides us access to spot markets. And it's exactly, there was the project of Nord Stream 2, which showed us that how fragile the strategy just simply to rely on integrating the market to the Western Europeans markets, because then this project might block physically the access to the spot markets as currently we know this. So our dilemma was the following, basically, that just simply integrating to the European market might be not enough. We have to integrate our markets to the global ones, and then we think that the LNG might be an interesting option for Central Europe. And we were pleased to hear that among the 7 ships which left Sabine Pass, 1 of them went to Europe. So the market really underpins what the politicians, the policymakers, and the analysts saw, that it can be an interesting option to Europe. So then that's really something that we are looking for. I think everyone around the table and us for Central Europe, that can be interesting.
Great. And I want to follow up, because don't worry, we'll get back to Nord Stream 2 for sure a little bit later, as well as the role of US LNG and all of this. But Mr. Kunderjavi, from the point of view of Slovakia, you've got a lot of the same issues that face Hungary and other members of the V4. The sort of physical progress that's been made in recent years, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's regulatory changes and things like that, what does the European Energy Union mean to you in terms of solving some of the energy security challenges that you faced over recent years? And I mean, obviously it's still a work in progress, but I'd be curious if you could give sort of an interim appraisal of the vision that's been laid out so far.
Okay, good afternoon. I would like to start by saying that Slovakia is rather typical representative of the countries of our region. We are small. We are very much industrialized and export-oriented, and finally, we do not possess natural resources, including energy resources. And that is why we like to listen to the melody or talkings about how to improve energy security. And last year, maybe you know, European Council in March adopted a new framework strategy that is called Energy Union. And of course, we are a big fan of it, because we need diversification in the broadest sense, diversification of sources, suppliers, and routes. Slovakia traditionally is on 100% dependent on energy supplies from Russia, and then I'm not talking only about gas, but that's valid for crude oil, and that's valid to the sector of nuclear energy. So basically all these 3 strategic means of energy we import from Russia. And of course, there are advantages, but there are disadvantages too. And while in our history, let's say, reliability of supplies were rather high, but sometimes back in '68, when our political changes happening then time Czechoslovakia, but also a recent example is in 2009 there were disruptions of deliveries, and that had really bad impact on our industries. So of course, energy diversity is very dear to us, and we are trying to find a solution. However, we don't have access to the sea. We are a landlocked country, and that's why we are trying to do what is possible in landlocked countries. And that is to try to build interlinkages, interconnectors with neighboring countries. And good example is neighboring Hungary. We completed a new interconnection last year, gas interconnector, and we hope that will be part of a major interconnector in between Świnoujście and LNG terminal with Krk terminal on island in Croatia. And on top of that, of course, quite geopolitical issue is Ukraine. And as to the Ukraine, we made some investment and we made available reverse flows of gas. So I would say yes, also our position has improved vis-a-vis the past. And today we can get gas from Western Europe as well, and in such a way all three countries, Hungary, Slovakia and Poland, we were helping Ukrainians since 2014, and practically these three countries supplied last year 100% of gas they needed through reverse flow.
Right. Okay. You know, and I wanted to follow up on these points, Mr. Janczuk, with Poland, because there's a couple. You have an advantage that we don't have with the landlocked countries, in the sense that you actually do have an outlet to the sea. You have an LNG terminal, right? So it's a very different competitive advantage. Poland also, I guess, through the form of Prime Minister Tusk, was sort of the instigator of the notion of an energy union in the first place. So you have a different perch, a different perspective on things. I wanted to ask you both, you know, how do you see the energy security situation in Poland, and also how do you see the evolution of the energy union as addressing those issues and vulnerabilities that you do find?
Well, thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. Well, firstly, I should describe our domestic perception on to what extent has been done. I think the best example how far we are today in Poland compared to the situation 20 years ago is that since that very specific moment of making LNG terminal in Świnoujście fully operational, we can in 100% substitute our gas supplies from the Yamo pipeline. This is per annum around 10 BCM from LNG and from Germany, namely from the physical reverse flow at Malnov IP. That means we are fully secure. But I think all this, the melody we repeatedly we are in a certain mode for many years, that in the narrative that the corridor from Krk to Świnoujście and vice versa must be paved and so on. There is one trick we should really avoid, namely the situation when we will circulate the same Russian molecule in the new setting of interconnectors that will cost, of course, a lot and are only partially co-financed or subsidized by the European Commission from the dedicated financial instrument, which is CEF. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about this new architecture, because the energy union concept is a story about the new architecture, predominantly regional architecture, and the draft law that has been recently tabled by Commissioner Šefčovič is inter alia, of course, but also about the regional cooperation and how we want to well, practically implement a principle of solidarity, because that so far that was a sort of slogan imprinted to every single piece of our energy legislation, but we were lacking practical solutions. Now the Commission translated it into the concrete mechanism that will serve an SOS gas to the crisis-stricken member states if the, let's say, need or demand on the protected customers or consumers is satisfied. Mm-hmm. So this is important step forward. As always, not making everyone absolutely happy. But we think that what makes sense to create regional cooperation is to find such a combination of countries where in one group potential deficit countries might sit together with surplus countries. So this is exactly why the Commission decided to put into one basket Poland, Slovakia, and unfortunately without Hungary. This is another story, and Czech Republic, and on one side, and Germany. Yes, so we are talking about only a crisis situation where the gas is really really missing. Completely different story is a daily scenario when we don't have to face or manage any sort of emergency situation, and then we have to firstly think about two aspects that are quite important for us. It's contractual transparency, which means to our understanding that we need to achieve a level playing field effect between Central Eastern contracts and Western contracts. So, in other words, we should get rid of any abusive clauses that are blocking, harming the development of the market in our part of the continent. And also, we should think about the upgrading our interconnectors to make them working bi-directional. Right. That's a second aspect. So, as I said, the draft law is on the table now. It's momentum because both co-legislators started to work on that. And there will be a very hard fight, which at the end of the day will show what is the final design of the energy union, how far we want to share our national energy security architecture with other neighboring countries, and definitely we are on the right track. Right. But that will cost us more political effort within the coming months or even years.
Like everything else in Europe, right? Mr. Dunnigan, I wanted to ask you from the point of view of the U.S. I mean, obviously, for decades, energy security in Europe has been a priority foreign policy goal. But in recent years, whether it's under Secretary Kerry, former Envoy Pasquale, Envoy Hochstein, yourself, energy security, and especially energy security in Europe, seems to have become a relatively important kind of a fundamental plank in U.S.-European relations. And I wanted you to sort of discuss, you know, what are the drivers from the point of view of Washington behind that? I mean, is it just to give more economic and geopolitical security to, including some NATO allies? Is it to push back against certain little green unnamed countries and their exploitation of the energy weapon? Does it have a commercial element in terms of promoting U.S. businesses? If you could sort of walk us through how European energy security is a key plank of U.S. foreign policy, that would be great.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I always learn something at the events and reports from the Atlantic Council, so I think it's very helpful to do forums like this. So you're right, it is not new that the United States has been interested in and supportive of European energy security. I mean, earlier in my career, I worked on the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, which the United States was a huge supporter of that pipeline. As Ambassador Morningstar knows, we don't have a single commercial interest in that pipeline. So the Energy Bureau was created in the State Department out of recognition of the nexus between our national security and energy policy. Energy policy affects economic growth, climate goals, and political stability, not only for us, but for our allies and partners around the world. And so Europe's energy security is very closely tied to our own national security because Europe's national security is tied closely to ours. David mentioned that we have the USEU Energy Council next week. The US Energy Council is chaired by Secretaries Kerry and Moniz on our side and their counterparts from the European Commission, the High Representative Mogherini, Vice President Šefčovič, and Commissioner Cañete. So I think what we'll do at this council is, first of all, we'll take stock. You know, how have we worked together and made progress over the last several years? Europe's made a lot of progress in the last 5 years with the third energy package and other steps that my colleagues here have mentioned. But I mean, there are some real tangible things that we've accomplished by working together. And you know, you asked earlier, do we really still need to focus on this? You know, Ukraine, after all, got through the winter and has done okay. That didn't come without effort. I mean, that came with a lot of diplomatic engagement by Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, United States, the Commission, some technical changes. But you're right, I mean, Ukraine got through the winter this year importing more European gas than Russian gas. And that doesn't mean that Russia won't continue to supply Ukraine and the rest of Europe, and that Russia shouldn't. It will continue to be an important supplier of gas to Europe. But when it is the only supplier for a country, it creates a vulnerability, as would any dominant supplier relationship, not just Russia. So I think when we take stock at the Energy Council meeting next week, we'll look at some of our progress. I think Ukraine is one area. The Baltics no longer being an energy island is another area where we've seen a lot of progress with the opening of the Independence FSRU off the coast of Lithuania, the electrical connections. The Southern Corridor, we've seen the Southern Gas Corridor bringing Caspian gas into Europe. We've had groundbreakings now in Azerbaijan, Turkey, and in a couple of weeks we'll have one in Greece. That pipe is being laid, it's being put into the ground. This is a real diversification project that's actually being built. So real progress, and it's come from a lot of European and US cooperation. We've also, this is not exactly related, but I think it is, the Paris Agreement. You know, the Europeans and the United States, we worked very closely together to forge this global consensus on the importance of working together to address climate change. So I think we've had a lot of progress to celebrate. I would include in that list the start of US LNG exports. And we talk a lot about how it's an energy achievement, what happened with the opening inauguration of Cheniere's facility at Sabine Pass, but it's also a foreign policy achievement because the US will be a reliable, market-based supplier to global markets. And that's not only good for our energy security, it's good for the energy security of our partners and allies around the world. So I'm very much looking forward to US LNG being part of the diversification solution in Europe and in other countries around the world. So looking forward, I think the title of our panel is, you know, what are the challenges? Because there's more work to do. And just looking at US LNG, you know, it doesn't matter how many molecules we're putting on the market, if once it reaches Europe, it can't enter Europe and then move freely throughout the continent. And so, you know, getting FSRUs in the right places, one off the coast of Croatia on Kirk Island, I think makes a lot of sense. Finishing some of the interconnector work that needs to be done, the interconnector between Greece and Bulgaria, for example. You know, there are underutilized LNG terminals in Europe, but there are also a lack of terminals in places where gas really needs to reach, especially in Central and Southeastern Europe. I think US LNG will be part of that solution. It provides Europe, which in many countries still face a dominant supplier situation, with flexible, market-based pricing, reliable source of gas. if I had to sort of underline where I think the United States and Europe really see eye to eye on the importance of energy policy and national security, it really is in the principles of the Energy Union document that my colleague referenced. Diversification of sources, fuel types, and routes. And if a project doesn't fulfill that goal of diversifying either your fuel type, your source, or your route, then it doesn't seem to be contributing to the diversification of energy in Europe. And I think that there have been projects, we've already mentioned Nord Stream, a Turkish Stream, when that was being discussed, was another such project. I think every time folks get distracted by those sorts of projects, you lose sight of what true diversification is.
Right.
So I'm looking forward to next week, the stock taking, and looking forward. There's more to do. There's more to do on your Ukrainian energy sector reform. There's some infrastructure projects we'd like to get done. We need to implement the Paris Agreement. And so there's more work to do, but I think that we've actually had some real successes to point to.
That's great, thank you. No, and since you served it up on a platter, I wanted to go ahead and grab it. Nord Stream 2, because you make a reference to this in March, I believe it was, a number of states, I think it was 9 Central and Eastern European states, wrote a letter to the European Commission basically calling this project, and for anyone here, I doubt anyone here doesn't know what Nord Stream 2 is, but it's a proposed pipeline across the Baltic. It would be an expansion of the existing Nord Stream pipeline, which is about half used already, so why not expand it? It's a proposed expansion that would bring more Russian gas directly into the European market. Not very politically popular in Central and Eastern Europe, and I'd just like to hear from the folks on the stage, why not? It's just a gas pipeline, and it's coming from a very long-term, reliable supplier. So I'm be curious, what are the specific objections to having an expanded Nord Stream?
Well, if you think that it's nice to have multiple pipelines, I think there used to be the saying that happiness is a multiple pipeline. But then at the moment we have 3 pipeline systems which bring Russian gas to Europe. It's one through Ukraine, one through Poland, the EMA system, and through Baltic Sea. Well, we expect that if there is Nord Stream 2 being built, then probably Ukrainian transit will be finished. So you basically go from 3 systems to just 2. And that seems to be less viability. At the same time, I must say that probably my Slovak colleagues will be much more vocal when it comes to Nord Stream.
All right. Well, please dive in, because one of the questions, and the ambassador just brought it up, cutting out Ukraine as a transit country. In both 2006 and 2009, the European Commission had issues with Ukraine's reliability as a transit country. So some would argue that bypassing Ukraine as a transit country is not the worst thing in the world. But I would just like to hear your thoughts on the wisdom or folly of Nord Stream expansion. Yes.
Okay. We have a couple of problems with Nord Stream 2 project. We are listening from our partners, major partners on EU stage, that this is a pure commercial project. But you already indicated a letter of 9 prime ministers, and that was not the first one. You already sent 3 sets of letters, starting with energy ministers, continuing with again, prime ministers, and finally this last letter, which was sent in March. And basically, problems are following. That problems go, of course, beyond commercial aspect. We think there might be a problem with energy security as such, because when promises which were given by a major shareholder of consortium are fulfilled in the sense that objective is to bypass Ukraine. So that means effectively traditional and most important gas corridor would be abandoned. And that means 140 billion cubic meters. Plus, we have to think of also underground storages in Ukraine. That is more than 30 billion cubic meters. And then, of course, that would mean that nowadays three different corridors or routes will be diminished just to two. And on top of that, these two, that means Nord Stream 1 and 2 plus Yamal, they would go practically the same direction to one EU member country, and that is Germany exclusively. So this is preoccupation as far as security. Then, of course, as it has been mentioned already, it has a clear geopolitical impact. And we've got Ukraine, we know what happened in Crimea, and we know what's going on in the eastern part of Ukraine. And of course, EU and US is giving helping hand to Ukraine. So I think it would be a little bit stupid on one side giving them help, and on the other hand preventing them to earn something like $2 billion on a yearly basis, what is net income to their budget. And of course, it has economic contents as well, because simply by preventing Ukraine getting this money from transit fees, the problem would be they probably will not be able to maintain their robust gas pipeline system. So again, that would, there is a threat, and that quality of that is going to deteriorate. And perhaps last preoccupation is a legal one. So we ask in those nine member countries, we ask in those letters Commission to consider a legal aspect, the whole story, you know, whether it's in compliance with the third energy package and so on and so on.
Right.
And of course with the objectives of energy union concerning diversification.
I don't know if either of the gentlemen from Poland or Hungary had anything more to say on that.
Yeah, I would refer to the figure a colleague of mine pointed out, namely $2 billion US dollars that Ukraine will simply lose if Nord Stream 2 is going to happen. I think we Europeans in the EU, we should double think before we say nothing, because this is about Nord Stream. We can't stop that project. We can demonstrate our disagreement for that, or simply stay silent. But before we stay silent, we should double think if this is logical. If one day, on Monday, we invest $1.8 billion US dollars in the financial assistance to the reform program for Ukraine. On Tuesday, we make loss on their gas check of $2 billion US dollars. So this is mutually conflicting each other. And that's also a discussion about the economic rationale of Nord Stream 2, because that is going to cost consortium something like 12 billion euros, while modernization of the existing system, namely the Brotherhood pipeline, will cost only 5 billion euros. So we think we can create a really smart reform program for Ukraine, reinvesting those incomes from the transit tariff into modernization of the existing infrastructure, and creating a solid source of budgetary incomes for the Ukrainian state. There is a legal issue also, namely the double standards, because this is, at least in our understanding, this is not an argument that something has not been applied to the Nord Stream 1, and therefore can be applied to Nord Stream 2. The legal regime has changed in the meantime, And this is exactly why the same third package rules are being applied to the YAMO pipeline, and due to the same reason should be also applied to the onshore and offshore section under the jurisdiction of member states to Nord Stream 2. So this is in our perception and the sense in which direction the concept of the energy union is going to evaluate. Yes. You asked before. This is exactly a test of credibility of the entire concept of the energy union.
But okay, see, I want to follow up here with all of you on this point, because everyone we have from by design, but everyone here is from Central and Eastern Europe. The 9 signatories of the most recent letter complaining about Nord Stream were from Central and Eastern European countries. Most of the prior comments as well. We've had a lot of silence from Germans and Italians and French. Doesn't that sort of put lie to the notion of the energy union and sort of a great harmonious vision about exactly what Europe has to do for energy security when there's such a clear split on the wisdom or folly of Nord Stream 2? Sir?
Yeah, that's exactly what I had in mind. So basically we are talking about the legal aspects, the commercial aspects, but actually the stake is much higher than that. So here what we talk about, it's the test of the European solidarity, because we have a project which is simply put good for Western Europe and bad for Central Eastern Europe in terms of pricing, in terms of competitivity of the economies, and just simply naming it a commercial project when 9 prime ministers just sent a letter on that. It's just to think further for all of us. So that needs really a European solution, and then it might go to a way when a bigger EU-Russia agreement is needed on some things, some technical things regarding that. So what to do with this legal aspects, what to do with Ukraine, and try to agree on all of that on a EU 28 level.
Okay. Great. I'm planning on throwing open to the floor in case anyone has any questions. There should be a few microphones here floating around. Would appreciate, we've got one up here in the right-hand corner. Would appreciate if you announce your name, your affiliation, and if you could phrase anything in the form of a question rather than a rant or comment, that would always be greatly appreciated. I don't know if anyone's got any questions now, they can raise their hands. If not, I've got plenty of my own. So, all right. We'll give you a few moments to think on that. I wanted to follow up on something Ms. Dunnigan said in terms of the potential for U.S. LNG to help bring liquidity to the market. But you also made a point that I think is relevant. Only one of the 7 gas shipments from Sabine Pass went to Europe, and it went to about as far away geographically from Central and Eastern Europe as you can get. I mean, it went into Portugal. And I wanted to, from all of you, but also from the U.S. perspective, how real is the potential of U.S. LNG to really help European energy security as long as the overwhelming majority of the LNG import terminals are both underutilized and in Western Europe and not to this point where they're needed? I mean, there has not been, after years of discussion, there has not been that much progress on Kirk Island. You know, it took Poland a long time. It took, Lithuania a while to get the floating storage unit up. How big a problem is the LNG infrastructure bottleneck in terms of realizing U.S. potential?
So I think there has been real progress in the opening of, you mentioned Poland, the opening of the LNG terminal in Poland at the end of last year is a perfect example. I mean, that is an LNG terminal that can import U.S. gas, and I would love to see that happen. I know there has been a lot of talk for a lot of years about a terminal off the coast of Croatia. I think that at the same time the gas market changed, the technology for moving gas changed. I think one thing that Croatia is looking at now, I don't want to speak for Croatia, but I understand, is the possibility of a floating storage and regasification unit. And I think in FSRU, you can move it in a lot more quickly, it's a lot more affordable, it's a lot more nimble. And again, that technology has really evolved in the last 5 or 6 years. And there are I know Greece is looking at importing possibly natural gas through a new or existing terminals, which could then feed into, if when the interconnector with Bulgaria is built, could feed into Bulgaria. So there are options. There is more work that needs to be done on infrastructure, and I think that the projects of common interest and the Connecting Europe facility that the Commission has, where it's funding some of these projects, is really essential. So I think prioritizing, getting European funds where possible to support some of these priority projects and moving on them will make a difference.
If I may, the U.S. shale gas revolution already helped greatly Europe back in 2008, 2009, when the U.S. stopped importing LNG because it got self-sufficient.
That's right.
Since 2008, the spot price at TTF exchange in Rotterdam has been consistently far better than the pipe price of pipe gas from Russia. So that's been very, very helpful for us and for Northwestern Europe, definitely. When it comes to the LNG now coming to Europe, I think it lightens up one fundamental problem, which is until recently, when we talk about European unified market, the onus was always on Central Eastern Europe, talking about those small, tiny Central Europeans who didn't do the homework and didn't do connections. Well, guess what? The biggest missing link is between France and Spain. Spain has 7 large LNG terminals, which are used at a fantastic rate of 15 to 20%. So the French-Spanish connection, which is missing, and the French-Italian connection, which are missing, highlights the fact that what we actually need pretty much is really to create a unified European market. I see a gentleman who might say something about it later on from NG, so I hope to hear from that. But I really believe that creating a unified European market of 500 million people is not single issue in Central Eastern Europe. It really covers much of the continent. And we will all profit from having more interconnections and having real access to physical flows in time of need.
That's great. Yes?
I think from a buyer's perspective, by 2020 we all have a bright future, much brighter than we have today, because the investments that has already been done and they are on the way, it will pay off when the new sources would come online. So we are counting on the possibility of the southern corridor for our region, the Black Sea offshore potential, and of course LNG is a very serious option, and it's not just about the US LNG, but the whole global LNG market, which will be an oversupply situation, and we think that will play kind of a swing market role by 2020. So compared to what we have today and what will be the situation around 2020, that seems to be much different and much favorable from a point of view of a buyer.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. I didn't know if anyone in the audience here had any questions they'd like to pose. Going once, going twice. I do have one. I wanted to pick up something you mentioned earlier when you said there's no, we don't have domestic resources. You know, we don't have domestic energy resources in Europe. It's one of the few areas like Asia that doesn't have enough to meet its future needs. And I think the gentleman from Slovakia made a similar point. The U.S. also had a declining resource base a few years ago and greatly increased its reserves of natural gas by embracing hydraulic fracturing. Now, obviously, this is a pretty toxic topic in Europe, but you know, the geology is there in a lot of places. France, the UK, Poland had some experiences with it, Romania perhaps. So there were bits and pieces of prospect and hope, and I wanted to ask you, because we spent all this time talking about different ways to import energy, whether it's, you know, US LNG or different pipelines or, you know, the Southern Corridor. Are there really intrinsic political, environmental, geological obstacles to just fracking in Europe? Anyone want to take that?
I think,
yeah.
There's, at the end of the day, when you go through the geology and everything else, there's one fundamental difference between Europe and the US, and that's the ownership of the mineral rights. And that's a fundamental thing. In Europe, you can own the land, but you never own what's below the ground. The sovereign owns it. So if somebody comes and says, I would like to frack in your garden, the answer is usually frack off, because no, there's nothing you gain from it. Now, I went in the US to Buchan Field in North Dakota. I went to Eagle Ford in Texas. Eagle Ford used to be, the area of Karnes City used to be the poorest county in Texas, which suddenly, thanks to oil, tight oil, has plenty of millionaires. Buchan Field was a godforsaken place in North Dakota, where people suddenly have money thanks to oil, because they have mineral rights as well as the land rights. I think this single difference defines the major obstacle to anything like fracking in Europe, because what we see in Europe is that in many places, opening any sort of mine is very difficult, any. And opening a fracking mine, I think Poland has experience with this recently, which wasn't only geology, but also the fact that people simply didn't like much the idea of somebody pumping plenty of water with chemicals underground.
Right.
So I'm not really sure that the shale gas boom and tight oil boom is possible in Europe, quite honestly. I can speak from my country, which we tend to joke about it, but it's a very sad joke. I mean, we say in Europe that we have moved already from NIMBY to banana.
What's banana?
NIMBY is not in my backyard. Banana is absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. It's a very sad joke. If you want to remain an industrial country, a pretty rich country, I mean, we have to sometimes build something.
Right. Fair enough. Any other ideas? I mean, because the State Department had promoted, unconventional gas development all around the world as well, but I wasn't sure if that was still, one of the things that it's trying to do in order to bolster, European security.
Well, what we did, so, the U.S. has an all-of-the-above energy strategy. We use fracked gas, fracked oil, renewables, nuclear. This all-of-the-above energy, strategy has worked for us and makes us more secure. We've never said to another nation, you must do nuclear, you must do you must frack for natural gas or oil. But what we have said is that if you want to do that, if you're looking into doing it, we just went through a revolution here, and we have a lot of lessons learned, right? We've learned what works, what doesn't, how to work with local communities, how industry and local regulators can work together, what are the best practices. So we do have the Unconventional Gas Technical Engagement Program, UGTEP, which works with governments, local and subnational governments and communities, if they are interested in fracking, to sort of share our lessons learned. But in the end, every nation has to make its own choice. I would say, though, that this is a true story. I was once lectured in Europe, and I won't tell you the country, about the dangers of fracking. And the next question was, when are you going to send us your fracked LNG? So, I mean, you have to have a strategy that has diverse sources, and that might not include fracking, but there has to be a range of fuel types. And I think the European Energy Union strategy recognizes that. So where we can be supportive, where countries are interested, we're very happy in helping, but it's up to each nation to determine its own mix.
Fantastic. Sir?
Fully agree. This perfectly suits to the strategy from 2014 and the recent documents. I can talk only about the political barriers, but we should make one step backward to 2013, when heads of V4 countries created a coalition against any new regulations to be imposed on all, in fact, EU member states regarding the fracking itself. So we think that there are regulations on environmental impact assessments, and there is a water framework directive, and this is fairly enough, speaking openly. But I think those countries like Germany or France that decided to impose on themselves moratoriums, it's very tempting to create more regulatory barriers at the EU level, and this is exactly what the V4 countries like to avoid. So this about the politics on geology, I think, at least in the case of Poland, we should wait a bit more, definitely need more drillings and more samples to be double-checked.
Fantastic. You're making the Energy Union sound like a dream project, by the way, there. So, yes, we've got a question here from a gentleman in the audience.
Thank you. It's Dana Marshall with Transnational Strategy Group. And I wonder if I maybe could ask Robin or colleagues from some of the EU member states as well to give us a little bit of a scene setter for next week's council meeting. What would, in particular, I'd be interested to know what areas of focus the U.S. side might have for the Commission. What areas might you suggest that they should focus more attention on, more priority, more funding? And, of course, from the EU side as well, what do you see as the areas of priority in Brussels across the table next week?
Thank you.
I think the Commission in the United States are very closely aligned on where we see the priorities in the strategic projects. I think, the projects, the priority list for infrastructure projects was something like 250 projects long, and then that list has since been narrowed, and I think that all of the projects that we would see from our perspective as important infrastructure projects are on the narrowed projects of common interest. I think looking at this Energy Council, it's coming at an interesting time. It's getting toward the end of this administration in the United States. I don't know that it will be the last, but it's, we're getting to the end. But we've had a few really important developments. The Paris Agreement and the signing of the agreement on April 22nd. That really does set the stage for how the European Union and the United States work together, not only on our own commitments, but helping our partners and allies around the world implement their own commitments. So I think that's one big change. The ongoing crisis between Russia and Ukraine's energy independence, I think, continues to be a focus in energy sector reform in Ukraine. Getting some of these other infrastructure projects done, like I said, I think we're very much aligned on how we see moving forward, how we see those projects moving forward. I do think, I don't want to overemphasize it, but since today's conference is about LNG, I do think that the changes in global markets on the gas side are relevant. And I think both the United States and the European Union, the Commission, see that a better supplied global market that has a little more flexibility for buyers will have an impact on European energy security. And so I think that this week's opening of the Sabine Pass and the inauguration and the first shipment reaching Portugal last week is again an area where we see very aligned interests. So I'm looking forward to next week. I think we will map out how we continue to work together going forward. But I think we can also, like I said before, sort of count off some real successes in the way we've worked together.
I don't know if anyone from Europe wanted to add to that. Yes.
Perhaps one thing, a part of diversification, which is dear to all of us, I think it is important to mention that a couple of our countries have supplementary objectives in its energy policies that comprises also improvement of nuclear safety. Let's say in Slovakia, it's also a big issue. Then, of course, what Robin has said about COP21 results. Let's say we are preoccupied with renewables, of course, and we want to increase the share of carbon-free or low-carbon electricity generation. Generally, of course, we are aiming at or trying to lower our energy consumption. Mm-hmm. And then things like continue to build oil and fuel storage facilities. Yeah, let's say in Slovakia we have them for about roughly just under 100 days, but any improvement in that is of course good. And after all, last thing, it's energy efficiency.
Right.
And I'm sorry, just to add quickly, my colleague, the Deputy Assistant Secretary from the Department of Energy, Paula Gant, will be on the next panel, and she can speak to this much better than I can, but we also have a range of technical issues that we cover under the Energy Council. So things like energy efficiency and fuel standards and electric vehicles and regulatory issues. The Department of Energy leads 2 working groups covering those issues, and so those will be part of the dialogue as well. But Paula is much more conversant than I am on those issues.
Well, thank you very much. I wanted to thank our panel for a great discussion today, very enlightening on Europe, and we're about out of time here. I did want to let you know we've got a second panel that will be up. We're going to have a 15-minute break, so if you could be back here around 3:20, that would be great. Thank you very much.